A quiet palace inspection suddenly turned explosive when a royal guard ordered Camilla's grandson to unlock a hidden wardrobe no one was supposed to question. What they uncovered inside shocked even senior aides, raising serious concerns about missing items tied to the late queen's private legacy. Reports suggest pieces thought lost for years may have been concealed in plain sight. Now, questions are growing fast, and the palace is under pressure. Stay with us. What exactly was hidden, and who knew? The day had started like any other inside the royal residence. Staff moved with quiet precision. Every step followed routine. Every action was measured. There was no sign that anything unusual was about to unfold. Corridors remained calm. Doors opened and closed softly. Conversations were kept low. According to reports, it was a standard internal inspection, something that happened from time to time, rarely drawing attention. Most staff treated it as just another part of palace life. But then, something changed. Sources suggest a senior royal guard suddenly shifted focus. His attention moved toward an area that had not been part of the original inspection route. It was subtle at first, almost unnoticeable, but those nearby began to sense it. Because this space was not usually questioned. It was not marked as restricted. It was not flagged in official logs. And yet, in that moment, it became the center of attention. Camilla's grandson was present nearby. Reports indicate he had been moving casually through the area, with no reason to expect anything unusual. But that quickly changed. The guard approached him directly. The request was simple, clear, controlled. He was asked to open a wardrobe. At first, it did not sound significant. A basic instruction. Something that could easily be explained as part of routine verification. But insiders suggest the tone behind the request told a different story. It was not casual. It carried weight. And that is where the atmosphere began to shift. Nearby aides reportedly paused. Some stopped what they were doing. Others glanced briefly at one another, as if silently asking the same question, why this wardrobe? Because this particular piece of furniture had never been part of official conversations. Sources suggest it had always been treated as personal storage. Nothing more. No one had raised concerns about it before. No one had questioned its contents. So why now? The guard did not explain. At least, not openly. Instead, reports indicate he repeated the instruction, this time with more firmness. Not aggressive. Not loud. But clear enough that it could not be ignored. And this is where things took a turn. The grandson reportedly hesitated. Just for a moment. Not out of refusal, but out of confusion. Because there had been no prior indication that this wardrobe held any importance. Insiders believe that hesitation was enough to deepen the tension in the room. Because now, everyone was watching. Every movement. Every reaction. Every second that passed. The quiet environment began to feel different. Heavier. More focused. As he stepped closer to the wardrobe, the sound of footsteps seemed louder than before. The small distance between him and the doors suddenly felt significant. Why had this simple action become so important? Reports suggest no clear reason was given in that moment. No explanation. No background. Just the instruction. Open it. But that's only part of the story. Because what was not said often carries more weight than what is. The guard's posture remained steady. His attention did not shift. It was as if he already expected something, or at least suspected it. And that raised another question. Was this truly random? Or had this moment been building for some time? Sources suggest some staff began to feel uneasy. Not because they knew what would happen, but because they sensed something was about to happen. And that feeling spread quickly. The grandson reached the wardrobe. His hand moved toward the handle. Slowly, carefully. The room grew even quieter. It was not just silence. It was anticipation. Because now, there was no turning back. Insiders believe that even those who tried to remain calm could not ignore the shift in energy. Something about this moment felt different from routine checks. And this is where the tension deepened. The wardrobe itself looked ordinary. There was nothing unusual about its appearance. No markings. No signs of alteration. Just a standard piece of furniture placed where it had always been. And yet, all attention was fixed on it.
Why?
That question lingered in the air, unanswered. The grandson paused briefly before opening it. Not long enough to draw concern, but long enough to be noticed. Because by now, everyone understood one thing. This was no longer routine. What happened next raised even more questions. The guard stepped slightly closer. Not to intervene, but to observe more closely. His presence alone added to the pressure of the moment. Sources suggest that no one spoke. No one interrupted. Even those who might have asked questions chose not to. Because sometimes, silence feels safer than uncertainty. And this moment was full of uncertainty. The handle turned. The doors began to open. Slowly, carefully. And as the space inside started to reveal itself, one thought quietly formed among those present. What if this changes everything? Stay with us, because the next moment would begin to uncover something no one had expected. The doors continued to open, inch by inch. The contents were not yet fully visible. Shadows still covered parts of the interior. But already, something felt different. Not obvious. Not clear. But enough to shift the mood once again. Insiders believe that even before anything was fully seen, the sense of importance had already taken hold. Because sometimes, it is not the discovery itself that creates tension. It is the realization that a discovery is about to happen. And in that moment, everyone knew they were about to see something they were not prepared for. As the wardrobe doors opened fully, there was no immediate shock. At first glance, everything appeared completely normal. Clothing hung neatly in place. Fabrics were arranged with care. A few personal items rested on shelves, positioned in a way that suggested regular use. Nothing looked out of place. Nothing suggested urgency. For a brief moment, the tension seemed almost unnecessary. Some aides reportedly relaxed slightly, as if the situation might resolve itself quietly. Perhaps this had all been a misunderstanding. A simple check that would end without consequence. But then, something felt off. According to sources, one of the guards stepped closer, his attention narrowing. He did not react to what was visible. Instead, he looked beyond it. His eyes moved slowly across the interior, as if searching for something that was not immediately obvious. And that is where the moment shifted again. Because this was no longer about what could be seen. It was about what might be hidden. Reports indicate the guard reached toward the inner panel of the wardrobe. Not randomly, but with a level of focus that suggested intent. As his hand moved across the surface, there was a brief pause. A subtle detail had caught his attention. It was small, easy to miss. A slight difference in alignment. A panel that did not sit perfectly flush with the rest of the structure. To most people, it would have gone unnoticed. But not this time. And this is where things took a turn. With careful pressure, the guard tested the panel. At first, nothing happened. The room remained still. But then, slowly, the section shifted. A concealed space began to reveal itself. Insiders suggest the reaction in the room was immediate, but silent. No one spoke. No one stepped forward. But the energy changed. Completely. Because now, this was no longer routine. This was deliberate. The hidden compartment was not large, but it was clearly designed. Not accidental. Not improvised. It appeared to be part of the structure, or added with intention at some point in time. And that raised an immediate question. Who created it? But that's only part of the story. Because what lay inside mattered even more. Carefully, the compartment was opened further. The contents were not exposed all at once. Shadows still covered parts of the space. But slowly, shapes began to form. Wrapped items. Several of them. Placed in a way that suggested care. Protection. Preservation. Sources suggest that even the guard conducting the search appeared momentarily still. As if processing what he was seeing. Because this was not expected. Not fully. One by one, the items were brought into view. No sudden movements. No dramatic reactions. Everything remained controlled. Measured. But the silence in the room grew heavier. because the nature of these objects was becoming clearer. Reports indicate that early impressions pointed toward something significant. Not confirmed. Not officially stated. But enough to shift the mood instantly. These were not ordinary belongings. They carried weight. And this is where the situation became more complicated. Some aides reportedly stepped back slightly. Not out of fear, but out of recognition. A quiet understanding that what they were witnessing could have serious implications. Because if these items were what they appeared to be, then their presence here could not be easily explained. Stay with us, because this changes everything. The wrapping around the objects suggested they had been placed carefully. Not hidden in haste. Not forgotten over time. They had been stored. Intentionally. And that detail alone raised new concerns. Because this was not about something misplaced. This was about something concealed. Insiders believe that brief glances were exchanged between those present. Silent communication. Unspoken questions. No one wanted to jump to conclusions. But the possibility was there. And it was difficult to ignore. Because reports suggest that some of these items may have matched descriptions of pieces long believed to be missing. Not publicly missing, but internally noted. And that changed everything. What happened next raised even more questions. The guard reportedly maintained composure, but his actions became more deliberate. Each item was handled with care. Observed closely. As if confirming something internally before taking the next step. No announcements were made. No statements recorded in that moment. But the significance was clear. Because if these items were indeed connected to the late Queen's personal collection, as some insiders believe, then this discovery was far more serious than anyone had anticipated. And yet, nothing was confirmed. Everything remained in that uncertain space between suspicion and proof, which only made the situation more intense. Because without confirmation, every possibility remained open. The room remained quiet, but the weight of the moment continued to grow. Each passing second made it harder to dismiss what had been found. And this is where the deeper questions began to form. How long had these items been here? Who had access to this wardrobe over the years? And most importantly, who knew about the hidden compartment? Because something like this does not go unnoticed forever. It may remain hidden, but it is rarely unknown. And that thought alone shifted the direction of the entire situation. Because now, this was not just about discovery. It was about responsibility. And that is where the real mystery begins. Long before the wardrobe was opened, there had been quiet concerns. Nothing public. Nothing confirmed. But according to reports, small inconsistencies had appeared within internal records over the years. They were subtle. Easy to overlook. At the time, they did not seem urgent. Items that should have been accounted for were not always where they were expected. Entries that once matched began to show slight gaps. Sources suggest these issues were often explained away. Clerical errors. Misfiled documents. Routine transfers between royal residences. All reasonable explanations. All accepted without deeper investigation. But now, those past explanations were being questioned. Because the items discovered inside the wardrobe appeared to connect directly to those missing records. And that changed everything. Insiders believe this was not just about valuable objects. It was about legacy. The late Queen's personal collection was not only historically important, it carried deep emotional meaning. Some items were reportedly gifts from foreign dignitaries, carefully chosen, symbolizing relationships between nations. Others were tied to private moments, events that shaped her life away from the public eye. These were not objects that could simply disappear without notice. And yet, some had. What happened next raised even more questions. At the time, those small discrepancies had not triggered alarm. Reports indicate they were documented, but not escalated. There was no immediate reason to suspect anything serious. But now, with the wardrobe discovery, those records were being revisited. Quietly. Carefully. Sources suggest senior officials began reviewing past inventory logs in detail. Each entry was examined. Each movement tracked. They were not just looking for mistakes anymore. They were looking for patterns. And this is where things became more complicated. Because the deeper they looked, the less clear it became. Some records aligned perfectly. Others did not. Timelines overlapped in ways that were difficult to explain. Items appeared to move between locations without clear documentation. At first, it seemed like disorganization. But then, a different possibility emerged. What if it was not disorganization at all? But that's only part of the story. Insiders believe internal discussions began to shift in tone. At first, the focus had been on understanding the discovery itself. But now, attention turned toward something more serious. How did these items end up hidden? Because if they had been misplaced over time, there should have been a clear path. A trail. A series of small errors leading to one result. But if they had been intentionally placed, then someone had made that decision. And that possibility could not be ignored. Reports indicate that access logs were reviewed next. Who had entered the area? Who had handled storage? Who had the authority to move items without raising questions? The list was not large. But it was not small either. And that created a new layer of uncertainty. Because now, this was not just about missing items. It was about access, control, responsibility. Stay with us, because the next detail is critical. As the investigation continued quietly, sources suggest different opinions began to form within the inner circle. Some believed this situation might still have a simple explanation. A chain of oversights. A slow accumulation of small errors that eventually led to this outcome. Others were not convinced. They believed the nature of the discovery, the hidden compartment, the careful wrapping, the preserved condition, pointed toward something more deliberate. Something planned. And that difference in perspective created tension. Because without clear evidence, both possibilities remained open. And neither could be proven. This is where the mystery deepened. Because the more they searched for answers, the more questions appeared. Reports suggest some of the items found in the wardrobe matched descriptions of pieces that had been flagged years earlier. Not publicly, but within internal documentation. At the time, their absence had not been treated as urgent. Now, it was impossible to ignore. Because they had not just been misplaced. They had been hidden. And that realization changed the entire narrative. Keep watching, because this is where everything begins to connect. The timeline became a central focus. When were the items last officially recorded? When did they first go missing? And how did those dates align with access to the wardrobe? Sources indicate that answers were not immediate. Some records were incomplete. Others were unclear. But small connections began to form. Not enough for conclusions, but enough to raise concern. Because the idea that this situation could span years, possibly longer, introduced a new level of seriousness. This was no longer a single event. It was a chain. A sequence of actions or oversights that had gone unnoticed for far too long. And now, it was being uncovered piece by piece. Insiders believe that the weight of this realization began to settle across those involved in the review. No one spoke openly about conclusions. But the direction of the investigation had clearly changed. Because now, they were not just asking what happened. They were asking why. And that question is always harder to answer. The palace remained silent. No external statements. No acknowledgement of the situation. But internally, the pressure was growing. Because if the truth pointed toward something deliberate, then the consequences would extend far beyond a single discovery. And if it pointed toward oversight, then it raised concerns about systems meant to protect the royal legacy. Either way, the outcome carried weight. And that is what made this moment so critical. Because there was no simple resolution. No easy explanation. Only a growing mystery that refused to stay contained. And as the investigation continued behind closed doors, one question became impossible to ignore. Were they uncovering a mistake? Or something far more intentional? After the discovery, everything changed, but not in a way the public could see. There were no sudden announcements. No visible disruptions. The palace continued to function as it always had. Staff moved through corridors. Schedules remained intact. From the outside, nothing appeared different. But inside, the atmosphere had shifted. According to reports, the area where the wardrobe was found was quickly restricted. Access was limited to a small group of senior staff. Those not directly involved were quietly redirected, with no explanation given. It was controlled, careful, intentional. Sources suggest the priority was clear: contain the situation. But that was not as simple as it sounded. Because even in silence, information moves. Insiders believe that within hours, quiet conversations had already begun. Not loud, not open, but present. Small exchanges between staff. Careful words chosen. Questions asked without being directly spoken. And this is where the pressure began to build. Behind closed doors, discussions reportedly grew more serious. Senior aides gathered. Not formally announced, but enough to signal concern. Each meeting focused on one central issue: how to handle what had been discovered. But there was no immediate agreement. Some insiders suggest that certain officials pushed for a full internal review. A detailed investigation that would trace every record, every movement, every possible connection. Others urged caution. Because the implications were not limited to the items themselves. They extended to perception. And perception could not be controlled once exposed. But that's only part of the story. Because another factor added even more complexity. Camilla's grandson. His presence during the discovery created a situation that required careful handling. Reports indicate that no accusations were made. No conclusions were drawn. But the connection could not be ignored. Sources suggest that internally, this detail was treated with extreme sensitivity. Every conversation, every decision had to consider not just the facts, but the relationships involved. And that made everything more delicate. Because this was no longer just about a hidden compartment. It was about who was connected to it. And what that connection might mean. What happened next raised even more questions. As discussions continued, reports indicate that legal advisors may have been quietly consulted. Not in a formal announcement, but enough to suggest that the situation had reached a serious level. Because once legal review enters a situation, it changes the tone. It means the possibility of consequences is being considered. And that realization did not go unnoticed. Insiders believe that tension began to spread beyond the immediate circle. Even those not directly involved started to sense that something was happening. Something important. But without clear information, uncertainty took its place. And uncertainty often creates more pressure than answers. Stay with us, because what happens next could change everything. The palace maintained its silence. No leaks. No statements. No acknowledgement of the discovery. But that silence did not reduce the weight of the situation. In fact, it increased it. Because the longer something remains unspoken, the more questions begin to grow around it. Sources suggest that internally, the risk of exposure became a growing concern. Not because information had been leaked, but because it could be. All it would take was one detail reaching the wrong place. And then, control would be lost. This is where the stakes began to rise. Because if the discovery became public, it would not be seen as a routine issue. It would raise deeper questions. About trust. About accountability. About how such a situation could happen within one of the most carefully managed institutions in the world. Insiders believe that scenario was quietly discussed. Not openly. Not in detail. But enough to shape the decisions being made. Because every action now had to consider one outcome. What if this reaches the public? And that question changed everything. Because it meant that the situation was no longer contained within the walls of a single room. It had the potential to expand far beyond it. And that is what made this moment so critical. Because while the palace worked to manage the situation internally, time was moving forward. And with it, the possibility that this carefully controlled silence might not last forever. Because secrets, no matter how well protected, rarely stay hidden forever. As the quiet investigation continued, the focus began to shift in a more serious direction. At first, everything had centered on the discovery itself, the wardrobe, the hidden compartment, the carefully stored items. But now, according to reports, attention moved toward a deeper question. How did this happen? Because finding the items was only the beginning. Understanding their presence was what truly mattered. Sources suggest that internal teams began a detailed review of past records. Access logs were examined line by line. Storage histories were revisited. Staff movement over the years was carefully mapped. Nothing was treated as too small to matter. Because sometimes, the smallest detail reveals the biggest truth. And this is where the process became more intense. Insiders believe that timelines were reconstructed step by step. When each item was last officially recorded. When it was first noted as missing. Who had access during that period? At first, the information seemed scattered. Incomplete. Difficult to connect. But slowly, patterns began to form. Not clear patterns. Not enough for conclusions. But enough to raise concern. And that is where the tension deepened. Because now, the investigation was no longer just about objects. It was about actions, decisions, possibilities. But that's only part of the story. At the same time, attention turned toward the items themselves. Reports indicate that efforts were made to verify each piece carefully. Nothing was assumed. Every object was examined against historical records. Descriptions were matched. Documentation was reviewed. Because accuracy was critical. If these items were truly part of the late Queen's personal collection, as some insiders suggest, then their identification had to be precise. And that process took time. Sources believe that those closest to the Queen's legacy were deeply unsettled by the situation. Not because conclusions had been reached, but because of what the discovery represented. The idea that such items could have been hidden away raised serious concerns. Not just about the past, but about the systems in place to protect that legacy. And this is where uncertainty remained. No official confirmation was made. No public acknowledgement was given. Everything stayed behind closed doors. But internally, opinions began to take shape. Some insiders believed this situation might still have a simple explanation. A chain of small oversights, miscommunication, administrative gaps that slowly led to this outcome. Others disagreed. They pointed to the hidden compartment, the careful wrapping, the preserved condition of the items. To them, it suggested intention, planning, control, and that difference in perspective created quiet tension within the inner circle. Because without clear evidence, neither side could prove their view. And without proof, the situation remained unresolved. What happened next raised even more questions. The palace continued to maintain silence. No leaks, no statements, no signs that anything unusual had taken place. But that silence was not empty. It was filled with decisions. Careful ones. Strategic ones. Sources suggest that every step moving forward was being weighed against potential outcomes. Not just internally, but externally as well. Because once information like this reaches the public, it cannot be controlled. And that risk remained present. Stay with us, because this final detail changes everything. As the investigation moved forward, one reality became impossible to ignore. There might not be a simple answer. No single moment. No clear explanation. Instead, what they were uncovering could be a series of events, small, gradual, and unnoticed at the time, that led to this discovery. Or something far more deliberate. And that uncertainty became the most powerful part of the story. Because without clarity, every possibility remains open. And every possibility carries consequences. Insiders believe that even those leading the review understood this. The outcome would not just resolve a mystery. It would define how the situation was remembered. As an oversight, or something else entirely. The palace doors remained closed. The discussions stayed private. But the weight of what had been uncovered did not disappear. It remained, growing, waiting, because sooner or later, the truth finds its way out. And when it does, it rarely arrives quietly. Do you think this will end quietly, or is something bigger coming?